Lena worked in a small cafe that stood at the corner of a busy street, filled with the noise of cars and people who were always in a hurry. She wore a plain uniform and carried trays from one table to another from morning until night. She was quiet and gentle, never speaking more than she had to, and the customers barely noticed her. They only saw a waitress who smiled politely and disappeared into the kitchen. She never complained and always did her work with care. But behind her calm face, there was a deep silence she carried inside, a memory that never left her. Sometimes when the cafe was quiet and the soft sound of music played from the radio, she would pause for a second and close her eyes as if she was listening to something. Only she could hear she had grown up in a small town far away from the city. Her childhood was simple and filled with love, especially from her grandmother, who raised her when her parents left to find work. Her grandmother was kind and had a small, upright piano that stood by the window. It was old and the paint had faded, but to Lena it was the most beautiful thing in the world. Every evening after dinner, her grandmother would sit beside her and guide her small fingers on the keys, teaching her to press gently and feel the sound instead of forcing it. The piano became her secret world, a place where she could speak without words. Her grandmother used to say, "Music is not about playing. It is about feeling every note. When you feel it, others will feel it too." Those words stayed in Lena's heart forever. As she grew older, she began to play small tunes by herself, and whenever she played, her grandmother would close her eyes and smile. But life changed quickly when her grandmother fell ill and passed away. The house became quiet and empty, and soon Lena had to leave the town to find work. She came to the city with no money and no plan, only a few clothes and a small notebook filled with her grandmother's handwritten music. Notes. She found a job as a waitress in the cafe, and slowly the days turned into months and then years. She forgot what it felt like to sit in front of a piano. The city was loud and fast, and there was no space for dreams. One rainy evening, when she was cleaning tables, she noticed something new in the corner of the cafe. A large black piano had been placed there, covered with a cloth. She stared at it for a long time. Her heart began to beat faster. It looked grand and shining even though it was covered with dust. She asked her coworker about it, and he said the manager had rented it for a charity event that would be held next week. Lena smiled softly, but said nothing that night when she walked home. The sound of rain reminded her of old times. She could almost hear the piano notes and the rhythm of the drops falling on the street. She reached her small apartment and sat by the window thinking about her grandmother and the words she used to say. She imagined how it would feel to touch the keys again, but she shook her head and told herself that those days were gone. She was not a musician anymore. She was only a waitress trying to survive. The next few days went by as usual. The cafe was always full of people talking, laughing, eating, and leaving. She moved quietly between tables, never drawing attention to herself. Sometimes she would look at the piano still covered and unused. It seemed like a sleeping memory waiting to wake up on the day of the event. The cafe was decorated with lights and flowers. The tables were arranged neatly, and a small stage was set for the performance. Many guests were expected to come, most of them rich and elegant people from the city. Lena and her coworkers were busy preparing food and drinks. The manager looked nervous because the pianist who had been hired to perform had not yet arrived. Time passed and the guests began to enter, but there was still no sign of the musician. The manager kept looking at his phone and muttering something under his breath. Lena watched silently from the counter. Finally, after a few minutes, he put his phone down and said angrily, "The pianist just called. He is sick and cannot come. What are we going to do now? We cannot have silence during the dinner." One of the waiters laughed and said, half joking, "Maybe Lena can play. She used to play piano when she was little." Everyone chuckled, including the manager. But then he looked at her seriously and said, "Can you play even something simple?" She froze for a moment. Her hands felt cold and she did not know what to say. She wanted to say no, but a quiet voice inside whispered, "Yes." She nodded slowly and said softly, "I can play something simple." The manager sighed in relief and said, "Good, we only need a soft tune, nothing special, just something to fill the air. Go ahead." Lena looked at the piano standing silently in the corner. The crowd was still talking and eating. She walked toward it, her steps small and unsure. Her coworkers watched with surprise, some whispering and smiling. She sat on the bench and gently removed the cloth. The piano keys were smooth and shining under the lights. She took a deep breath. Her reflection was visible on the black surface she placed her hands on, the keys, and for a moment she did not move. Her heart pounded in her chest. She remembered her grandmother's hands resting over hers, guiding her to press softly. She closed her eyes and let her fingers find the right notes. The first sound was shaky and small, but it filled the room. The people continued to talk, not noticing her. She played a few simple notes slowly, one after another. The sound was gentle like a whisper. Her hands trembled, but she kept going. She was not playing for the guests, she was playing for herself, the way she used to when she was a child. Soon, the melody began to change. Her fingers moved with more confidence. Her body relaxed, and she felt a warmth spreading through her chest. She forgot about the crowd and the cafe. She was back in her grandmother's room, sunlight falling through the window, dust dancing in the air. Her grandmother smiling beside her. She played with her heart, and her eyes filled with tears one by one. The people began to notice the music. The voices in the room grew softer until there was only the sound of her piano. It was no longer simple. It was beautiful, deep, and full of feeling. She did not plan the notes. They just came out as if someone else was playing through her. She could feel every emotion inside her flow into the keys. Sadness, joy, love, and pain all mixed together. When she finally stopped, she sat still for a few seconds, her hands resting gently on the piano. The cafe was silent. Everyone stared at her as if waking from a dream. She looked up, nervous and shy, and then heard someone whisper softly, "That was beautiful." The silence broke into gentle applause. She looked down, smiling through her tears, not knowing that this simple moment would change everything in her life forever. After that night, the cafe felt different for Lena. She still came early every morning and cleaned the tables just like before, but the way people looked at her had changed. The workers who once ignored her now smiled when they saw her. Some even asked her to play again, but she always shook her head and said she was busy. She did not play for attention. She had played because something inside her had woken up that night. She could still feel it. Every time she passed the piano standing quietly in the corner, she felt like it was watching her, waiting for her to come back. The manager had been surprised by what happened. He told her that the guests had loved her performance, and a few of them had asked about her name. He smiled and said, "You should think about playing again." Lena only smiled politely and went back to work. But deep inside her, something was growing. She could not stop thinking about how it had felt when she touched the keys again. It was like meeting an old friend she had missed for years. That night when she went home, she could not sleep. She sat on her bed with the small notebook her grandmother had written long ago. She opened it carefully. The pages were old and yellow, but the notes were still clear. She traced her fingers over them, remembering her grandmother's voice saying, "Play with your heart, not your hands." She began to hum the old tune softly. Tears ran down her cheeks. She realized how much she had missed this part of her life. In the days that followed, Lena's story began to spread. One of the guests from the charity night had recorded a short video of her performance and posted it online. The video was short and simple, showing a young waitress playing with emotion and focus. The caption said she was asked to play a simple tune, but she played like a dream within hours. People started to share it more and more. Some said they cried, listening to her. Others said they could feel her emotions through the music. By the next morning, the video had been watched thousands of times. The cafe phone kept ringing. People wanted to know about the girl who played the piano. The manager could hardly believe it. He called Lena and showed her the video. She was shocked to see herself on the screen, her hands moving slowly over the keys. The comments were filled with words like beautiful and pure and magical. She felt shy and confused. She had never thought of herself as someone special. She just played what she felt that day. A few reporters came to the cafe to ask her questions, but she did not say much. She only said, "I just played from my heart." The cafe became busier than ever. People came, not only for food, but to see the girl who played the piano. They hoped she would play again. Some waited for hours, hoping she would sit down and touch the keys, but Lena never did. She was afraid that if she played again, it would not feel the same. She did not want to turn it into a show. For her, that night was something sacred. something she could not repeat on demand one evening after the crowd left. She stayed behind and cleaned as usual. The manager came to her and said gently, "You have a gift. Lena, maybe it is time you think about using it seriously." She looked at him unsure and said, "I do not know. I have not studied music. I only learned from my grandmother." He smiled and said, "Sometimes the heart is a better teacher than any school." He told her that a man from the audience had left his card and wanted to speak with her. The man was a well-known musician and composer who had been deeply moved by her performance. Lena hesitated but finally agreed to meet him the next afternoon. She went to a small music studio on the other side of the city. It was filled with instruments and recording equipment. The man greeted her warmly and said he had never seen anyone play with such honesty. He asked her to sit at the piano and play whatever came to her mind. She was nervous. Her hands trembled slightly, but when she started to play, the fear faded. The sound filled the room, gentle and emotional. The man listened quietly. His eyes closed when she finished. He smiled and said, "You have something rare. You do not play like someone who wants to impress. You play like someone who wants to speak from the soul." He offered to help her learn more and record her own music. Lena was overwhelmed. She had never imagined such a thing could happen to her. She thanked him and said she needed time to think. That night she walked home slowly. The streets were quiet and the lights reflected on the wet road. She thought about her grandmother and wondered what she would say if she saw her now. She could almost hear her soft voice saying, "Never hide your music. Lena, it was not given to you to keep it, was given to you to share." When she reached home, she sat by the window and looked at the small notebook again. She played the tune softly on the table with her fingers, imagining the keys in front of her. A sense of peace filled her heart. She knew that her life was beginning to change the next morning when she arrived at the cafe. The piano looked different to her. It was no longer just a piece of furniture. It was a doorway to a part of herself she had long forgotten. She touched the surface gently and whispered, "Thank you for waiting for me." Later that week, the cafe held another event, and this time the manager asked her if she would play again, but only if she wanted to. She smiled nervously and said yes. She sat down at the piano, her heart racing just like before, but this time there was no fear, only warmth. She began to play a simple melody from her grandmother's notebook. The crowd listened quietly and some closed their eyes. The music was soft and full of feeling. She could see the faces of strangers relax as they listened. She was not performing. She was sharing a piece of her heart. When the last note faded, the people clapped gently, but she did not care for applause. She cared only for the peace that came when she played. After that evening, Lena began to come to the cafe early before work. She would sit at the piano alone and practice, sometimes for a few minutes, sometimes for an hour. It became her secret ritual. The music helped her find herself again. People continued to talk about her video, and invitations began to arrive from different places asking her to perform. But she did not rush. She wanted to take things slowly and learn. She started visiting the musician who had offered to teach her. He guided her patiently and helped her understand how to write her own pieces for the first time in years. She felt alive again one morning when she sat at the piano. She realized that she was smiling without thinking. She was no longer afraid to be seen. She had found her purpose not in fame, but in the simple joy of playing the piano. The way she once did with her grandmother, she knew that her journey had just begun, and that the music inside her was finally awake again. The days passed quietly, but something inside Lena was no longer quiet. She began to feel music in everything around her, the sound of footsteps on the street, the wind that passed through the open door of the cafe, the laughter of people sitting by the window. Everything had its own rhythm. She started to carry a small notebook with her wherever she went, writing down small ideas and notes whenever she felt inspired. Sometimes she wrote only a few lines like "soft rain" or "broken heart healed by sound." The musician who had offered to help her invited her again to his studio. He told her to bring her own ideas and they would work on them together. She felt nervous but also excited when she arrived. He smiled and said, "Show me what you have." She opened her notebook shyly and said, "These are just thoughts." He looked at them carefully and said, "Every song begins with a feeling. You already have what you need now. You only have to let it grow." He helped her sit at the piano and told her to start with one idea. She closed her eyes and thought of her grandmother's hands holding hers. The music that came out was soft and full of longing. He listened quietly and began to write notes on paper together. They shaped her first original tune. It was slow and gentle with a melody that made people close their eyes when they heard it. He told her it was beautiful and they should record it. She felt shy but agreed when she played it again in front of the microphone. Her heart was beating fast, but her fingers moved naturally as if they knew the path already. When the song was finished, he played it back and she listened quietly. Tears filled her eyes because it sounded like a memory made real again. The musician said, "I think people need to hear this. It carries truth." He asked her if he could share it online under her name, and she nodded softly. Within a few days, people started to listen and comment. They said it made them feel peaceful and calm. Some said it reminded them of someone they loved and lost. She read every comment and felt both grateful and humble. She could not believe that something from her heart could touch strangers. She continued to work in the cafe, but now people came from other places just to see her and talk to her. Some asked her about her song, and she always answered politely, but she never pretended to be a star. She still cleaned tables and served coffee like before because she did not want to forget who she was. The piano at the cafe became her friend. She would play softly in the early mornings before anyone arrived or late at night when everyone had gone home. Sometimes she would close her eyes and imagine her grandmother sitting nearby listening quietly. One evening, a small girl came into the cafe with her parents and saw Lena playing softly. The girl stood near her and watched in silence. After a while, she asked, "Can you teach me to play like that?" Lena smiled and said, "Of course." She showed the little girl how to press one key at a time and how to listen to the sound, not just hear it. The girl laughed when she got it right. Her parents watched and smiled from the table after they left. Lena felt something warm inside. She remembered her grandmother teaching her in the same way. The next day, the girl came again with a small flower for her and said, "This is for you, because you made the piano sound happy." Lena kept the flower beside the piano and smiled whenever she saw it. Her days slowly began to change. She worked during the mornings and practiced or composed in the evenings. The musician kept helping her, and sometimes they performed together at small local events. She was always nervous at first, but the moment she touched the keys, everything around her disappeared. One evening after a small concert, a woman came to her and said, "Your music helped me through a hard time." "Thank you." Lena could not find words. She simply smiled and said, "I only play what I feel." On her way home, she thought about what the woman said and realized that music had a power she never understood before. It could heal hearts, not just entertain. One night, as she sat by the window of her apartment, she thought about her life, how far she had come from the quiet girl who served coffee to someone who now shared her heart through music. She was still the same person, but her world had become brighter because she finally found courage to do what she loved. She looked at the sky and whispered, "Thank you, grandmother. I'm still playing the tune you taught me." The next morning, the cafe was busy as usual, but something unexpected happened. A man wearing a dark suit entered and asked for her. The manager called her and she came forward politely. The man smiled and said he was from a music organization that supported new artists. He had heard her song online and wanted to invite her to perform at a community concert. Lena was surprised. She said, "I am not a professional." He replied that was exactly why they wanted her, because her music felt real. She hesitated, but then thought of her grandmother again and said softly, "Yes, I will come." When the day of the concert arrived, she was nervous more than ever. The hall was bigger than any place she had played before. She wore a simple dress and stood backstage, her hands cold and shaking. The musician who had helped her was there too, and said, "Remember, just play with your heart. That is all you need." She walked onto the stage. The lights were bright and she could see many faces waiting quietly. She sat down at the piano and took a deep breath. Her fingers touched the keys gently. The first note came out soft and clear. She started to play the melody she had written for her grandmother. It flowed like water, gentle and deep. She forgot the crowd, she forgot her fear. There was only music when she finished. The hall was silent for a second. Then the sound of clapping filled the room. She looked up, her eyes wide and full of tears. People were standing, applauding, smiling, some even crying. She bowed slightly and smiled shyly after the concert. Many people came to meet her. Some said her music had touched them. Others said it gave them peace. But what stayed in her heart was the feeling. While playing, she realized that this was what she was meant to do. Not to chase fame, but to share something true through her piano. When she returned home that night, she sat by her window and played the same melody quietly for herself. She thought of her grandmother again and whispered softly, "I did it for you and for everyone who still believes in dreams." She felt peaceful because she knew this was only the beginning of something greater waiting to unfold around her after the concert. Lena's life began to change in quiet but strong ways. She never planned for fame, but people started to recognize her more often. Some came to the cafe just to meet her and tell her how her music touched their hearts. She always listened, with a gentle smile, but inside she still felt like the same simple girl who used to serve coffee and clean tables every night. She would walk home through the quiet streets of the city thinking about how strange and beautiful life could be. She often thought of her grandmother and imagined how proud she would be to see her playing again. Sometimes Lena stopped by the small park near her apartment and sat on a bench listening to the sound of children playing. She liked to watch them laugh and run because it reminded her of the innocence she used to feel when she first learned piano. In those moments, she promised herself she would never let fame or attention change her heart. She would always play with honesty. One morning, the musician, who had been helping her, called and said that a famous orchestra was looking for someone to collaborate with for a special event. He said her name had been suggested, and that this could be a great opportunity. Lena was surprised, and at first, she hesitated. She said, "I am not ready for something that big." He replied, "You are ready when you believe you are ready." She thought about it for a long time and finally agreed. She wanted to grow and learn more when the day came. She went to the large concert hall for rehearsal. It was huge and filled with instruments. She felt small among the many professional musicians, but when she sat at the piano and played the first note, everything else disappeared. The conductor stopped and smiled, saying, "Your touch is rare. It carries truth and silence together during the practice." Lena felt nervous, but the other musicians were kind. They encouraged her and said that her playing brought emotion that they sometimes forgot in their routines. She listened carefully to their advice and practiced for hours until her fingers hurt, but she never complained. She wanted to give her best on the night of the concert. She looked at the audience from behind the curtain. It was full of people in elegant clothes. She could hear the murmur of voices and the sound of footsteps echoing across the hall. Her heart beat fast, but she remembered the words her grandmother used to say. Music is not about showing. It is about feeling. When it was her turn, she walked slowly to the piano. The lights shone softly around her. She closed her eyes and began to play her part. It was a mixture of her own melody and the orchestra's grand harmony. The sound filled the hall like a wave, rising and falling. Every note carried a piece of her story. When the performance ended, there was a silence that felt heavy and peaceful before the crowd began to applaud. She looked up and saw people standing, their faces soft with emotion. She bowed with a small smile, tears forming in her eyes. After the show, the conductor came to her and said, "Thank you for reminding us why we play music. It is easy to forget, but you made us remember." Those words stayed with her. She realized that her journey was not just about playing the piano. It was about touching hearts and bringing feelings to life. She continued to perform at different places, sometimes big halls, sometimes small community events, but she always stayed humble. She still worked at the cafe a few days a week because she wanted to keep her life simple. She said, "The cafe keeps me grounded and the piano keeps me free." One day, a young reporter came to interview her. He asked what inspired her the most. She answered quietly, "My grandmother. She taught me that even the smallest tune played with love can move mountains." The story was published and many people were moved by her words. She began to receive letters from people all over the world. Some told her how her music helped them through loneliness and pain. Others said it reminded them of someone they loved. She read every letter carefully and kept them in a small box in her room. They gave her strength whenever she felt tired. One evening, she received a message from a small town school asking if she would come and visit their music class. They had an old piano that no one played anymore, and the children wanted to learn from her. Lena smiled when she read it because it reminded her of her own childhood. She agreed to go on her free weekend. When she arrived at the school, the children were waiting excitedly. Their teacher introduced her and said they had been practicing a small song to welcome her. The children sang in their soft voices, and she felt tears in her eyes after they finished. She walked to the old piano. It looked worn out but still strong. She sat down and pressed a few keys. They sounded uneven, but she smiled and said, "Every piano has a voice. We just have to listen." She began to play a gentle tune, the same one her grandmother had taught her when she was a little girl. The children listened quietly. Some smiled, others closed their eyes when she finished. She told them anyone can make music if they listen to their heart. The teacher asked her to play with the children, and soon the small classroom was filled with laughter and sound. She spent the whole afternoon teaching them simple melodies before she left. One of the children gave her a drawing. It showed her sitting at the piano with the words, "Thank you for the music." She kept that drawing carefully folded in her bag when she returned to the city. She felt peaceful. She realized that what made her happiest was not the big stage or the lights, but these simple moments when she could share music with others. She went back to the cafe that night and played softly when no one was around her. Co-workers listened quietly from the counter. The sound filled the air with calmness. The manager smiled and said, "You were born for this." Lena laughed softly and said, "Maybe I was born to remember that music belongs to everyone, not just the famous." She continued to write her own songs, inspired by the people she met and the feelings she carried. Sometimes when she played, she could almost feel her grandmother's hand on her shoulder, as if saying, "I am proud of you." She never needed to hear it aloud because she already knew deep inside that she was walking the path her grandmother had always dreamed for her. A path made of simple notes that carried truth, love and hope into every heart that listened. Lena's life moved forward with a calm rhythm that felt right. She continued to play music for people, but never for fame or money. She believed music should be shared with love and honesty. Her days were filled with peace and her nights were quiet. Sometimes she still worked at the cafe, even though she no longer needed to, because she liked the sound of people talking and laughing. It reminded her of where she started. She always smiled when customers asked her if she was the girl from the video. She would say yes softly and return to her work. The piano in the cafe had become a symbol of hope for many people. They often asked her to play a song before they left, and she would play something gentle that made everyone silent for a moment. One evening while she was cleaning tables, a young man approached her. He was holding a small camera and said politely, "I am making a short film about people who changed their lives through courage. Can I record your story?" Lena hesitated at first. She did not like attention, but then she thought maybe her story could help someone find their dream again. She agreed. They sat near the piano, and he asked her simple questions. She told him about her grandmother and how music had always been a part of her. Even when life got hard, she said, "I thought I lost it, but music was just waiting for me to come back." When the short film was shared online, many people watched it and left kind comments. Some said they started learning piano again after seeing her story. Others said her courage gave them strength to follow what they loved. It made her happy to know her journey could inspire others. She never wanted to be a star. She only wanted to remind people that it is never too late to find yourself again one day. She received a letter from a concert hall in another city. They wanted her to perform at a charity event to raise money for children who had lost their parents in accidents. The letter said, "Your music has touched hearts. We believe it can heal too." She read it many times and decided to go. When she arrived at the concert hall, she met the children who would benefit from the event. They were shy but curious. One little boy asked, "Are you really going to play for us?" She smiled and said, "Yes, I will play for all of you and for everyone who needs hope." When the evening came, the hall was full, but Lena focused only on the children sitting in the front rows, their faces glowing with excitement. She began to play a new piece she had written. It was full of emotion and memories. The melody rose softly, then grew strong, then became quiet again. It was like telling a story of pain, turning into hope. She could see some of the children close their eyes and smile. Others held each other's hands when she finished. The hall was silent for a few seconds, and then filled with warm applause. The organizer thanked her and said, "Your music speaks to the heart." After the event, one of the children came to her and said, "When you play, it feels like my mother is near me again." Lena felt tears in her eyes. She bent down and hugged the child softly, saying, "She is always near you. Maybe through this music that moment stayed in her heart, forever. It reminded her why she played and why she wanted to keep sharing her gift after that. She decided to visit more schools and small towns to play for children and teach them simple tunes. She traveled by train carrying only a small bag and her notebook full of notes and ideas. Sometimes she played on old pianos, sometimes on borrowed ones, sometimes even on keyboards that barely worked. But no matter how small the place was, she played. With the same love she always had, people began to call her the woman who plays from the heart. She smiled when she heard it, because it was true. One afternoon she returned to the cafe after a long trip. Her coworkers greeted her warmly. They said, "We missed your music. The piano has been quiet too long." She laughed and said, "Then let me wake it up again." She sat down and began to play a soft tune. The customers stopped talking and listened. The cafe filled with peace again. Some had tears in their eyes because they could feel her sincerity. When she finished, they clapped softly. She looked up smiling and said, "Thank you for always listening." That night she stayed behind after everyone left. She looked around the empty cafe and whispered, "This is where it all began." She sat at the piano again and began to play the same song she played the first time she was asked to fill the silence. Her hands moved easily, the notes flowing like a river. She remembered the fear she felt that night, the laughter of her coworkers, and the moment when everything changed. She smiled and said softly, "Thank you for that moment because it gave me my life back." Just then the manager walked in quietly and said, "I knew you were special from the first time you played." She laughed and said, "You only wanted someone to cover for the missing pianist." He smiled and said, "Maybe. But it turned out to be the best thing that ever happened here." They both laughed softly and shared a moment of quiet joy. A few days later, she received an invitation to perform at a music festival that gathered artists from around the world. It was a big event with famous names. She felt nervous, but the musician who had helped her said, "You must go, not for fame, but to show that true music still lives." She agreed and prepared carefully. When she arrived at the festival, she saw many talented performers with grand instruments and elegant clothes. She felt small again, but she reminded herself that she did not need to prove anything. She just had to play from the heart. When her turn came, she walked onto the stage and looked at the large crowd. She sat down at the piano and took a deep breath. The lights were warm on her face. She began to play a piece she had written called The Promise. It was based on her grandmother's words about playing with feeling. The melody was deep and gentle, full of warmth and memory. People listened quietly, as if afraid to breathe. When she reached the last note, she lifted her hands slowly. The hall was silent, and then came a wave of applause stronger than she had ever heard. She looked up, smiling through tears. She did not feel like a star. She felt like a messenger of her grandmother's love. After the performance, several famous musicians came to her and said, "Your music is pure. It reminds us of what matters most." She thanked them humbly and said, "I only play what I feel." Later that night, she walked alone by the river near the festival hall. The city lights reflected on the water. She thought about how life had taken her from a small town to this moment, but she still felt like the same girl sitting beside her grandmother. Learning to press the keys gently, she closed her eyes and said quietly, "Thank you for guiding me all the way." She knew that her story was not over. There were still many songs waiting inside her heart. Songs she had not yet played, songs that would find their way into the world one day. Through her hands, she smiled softly at the thought and walked home under the quiet night sky, knowing that her journey was still unfolding, one note at a time. Years passed, and Lena's music continued to touch the hearts of many people. She had become known not as a star, but as a soul who could bring peace through sound. Her performances were never grand or full of show, but they were full of feeling, and that made them unforgettable. She traveled from town to town with her small bag and her gentle smile, playing for anyone who wanted to listen. Sometimes she performed in big halls, sometimes in small classrooms, sometimes even on the street under the open sky. She never asked for payment and often said, "I play because it keeps my heart alive." She had learned that the beauty of music was not in perfection, but in emotion. One morning she received a letter from a small village where her grandmother had once lived. The people there had restored an old community hall. and they wanted her to perform the first concert there. She felt her heart stir as she read the name of the village. It was the same place she had visited as a little girl holding her grandmother's hand. She decided to go. When she arrived, she saw familiar hills and trees. The scent of the air felt like a memory waiting to return. The people welcomed her warmly, saying, "Your grandmother used to play here long ago. We would be honored if you played her favorite song." She smiled and nodded. That evening the hall was filled with villagers, children, sat in the front and the elderly in the back waiting with quiet excitement. Lena sat at the piano and for a moment she felt her grandmother's presence beside her. She began to play the song her grandmother had taught her, the one she used to hum. Softly while cooking, the melody was old, simple, and full of love as the notes filled the room. Some people closed their eyes and others wiped tears when she finished. There was silence, then gentle applause. No one spoke for a few seconds because they all felt something deep inside. Lena stood up and said softly, "This song is from her heart, not mine. I only played what she gave me." After the concert, an old woman came forward and said, "I knew your grandmother. She would be proud of you, child." Lena smiled through tears and said, "I hope she can hear me still." She stayed in the village for a few days, visiting the places she remembered from her childhood. She walked to the meadow where she and her grandmother used to pick flowers. She sat on a stone near the river and wrote a few notes in her small notebook. The melody that came to her was calm and peaceful. She decided to call it The Return. It was not meant for anyone else, just for her. A few months later, she received another invitation, this time from a group of young musicians who wanted to learn from her. They had seen her videos and read about her journey. They wanted her to teach them how to play with feeling, not just technique. She agreed, because she wanted to share what she had learned when she entered the small music school. She saw eager faces full of hope. She told them, "I cannot teach you fame. I can only show you how to listen to your heart." She sat at the piano and played a simple tune, then asked them to close their eyes and tell her what they felt. One said it sounded like rain. Another said it felt like home. She smiled and said, "That is the secret of music. It is not what you play, but what you make people feel." Slowly, she became like a mentor to them, guiding them with kindness and patience. She never scolded them for mistakes. She said, "Mistakes are part of your song too." One day while she was teaching, one of the students asked her, "When did you first feel the magic of music?" She smiled and said, "When I was told to play a simple tune and ended up finding myself again." Her words made them all quiet because they knew that moment had changed her life. Years went by and Lena became older, but her hands were still steady and her heart still full of sound. She had no wish for fame. She only wished that her music would keep living even after she was gone. One night, she sat by her window looking at the stars. She thought about her journey, how she started as a simple waitress who only played when asked, and how that one moment of courage had opened a path she never expected. She whispered, "Thank you for that chance. Thank you for the music." She closed her eyes and smiled softly. A few weeks later, a big concert was held to honor musicians who had inspired people through their art. Many of her students organized it. They asked her to perform the final piece of the evening. She hesitated at first, but agreed. When she stepped onto the stage, the audience stood and clapped for her. She looked at their faces and saw many of her former students, people she had met, children she had played for, and friends she had made along the way. She sat at the piano and began to play The Return, the song she had written by the river. It was calm and warm. The notes floated like gentle waves, carrying years of love and memories. When the last note faded, she looked up and saw that the entire hall was silent. Everyone had tears in their eyes. The applause that followed was long and full of emotion. After the concert, one of her oldest students came to her and said, "You changed our lives with your music." She smiled and said, "No, my music only reminded you of what you already have in your hearts." A few months later, she decided to rest and spend time in the countryside. She lived in a small house surrounded by trees. She had a piano near the window, and every morning she played softly for the birds that gathered outside. One day while she was playing, she noticed a little girl standing near the fence listening. Shyly, she smiled and invited her in. The girl said, "I love how you play. I wish I could learn." Lena said, "Then come." I will teach you." They sat together, and she began to show her how to press the keys gently. The girls' laughter filled the room. It reminded Lena of her younger self. She thought this is how the music will continue, through hands that are still learning, through hearts that are still open. As years passed, people remembered her not as a famous pianist, but as a woman who made the world softer with her sound. Her students continued her teaching, sharing the same warmth and honesty in their own music. Whenever someone asked about her, they would say, "She taught us that music is not about being perfect, it is about